Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here in just a moment. For a few more to sign on. Sort of like college class, nobody arrives on time.
I think it's the 10-minute rule, right?
They sort of roll in. So, but I see them coming. All right, here, I think we're going to go ahead and get started since all of you are on time and may have some others join us. So good morning. I'm Dave Plashang. I'm the President, CEO, Managing Partner of Gilbert CPAs. Glad to have you here today. I'm here with Bobby Hales. Bobby Hales is also one of our shareholders, oversees the nonprofit portion of our practice. And she'll be facilitating the meeting today, keeping me in line, handling your chat questions, and certainly feel free to do that. Bobby, I think you have some rules of engagement you'd like to discuss.
Right. So let you all know that we are recording this session. So to the extent you want to circle back to some of the information or share it with your coworkers or your board members, that'll be available on the website. You'll be notified on how to connect to that after the session. As Dave said, if you have any questions, we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So to the extent you have questions on a certain slide or topic, go ahead and present that in the chat, and then I'll elevate that and we can discuss. There will be a couple of polling questions throughout the session. So, I encourage you to participate in that. And we expect the session to last about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. We will take questions again at the end of the presentation, but again, I'll just encourage you, if there's questions on a particular topic, let's go ahead and stop and address that at that point.
Great, thanks, Bobby. So I'm really happy and excited to be presenting this discussion on succession planning. This is an issue that I think many nonprofits face. Not all of them, or I'd say most of them, don't do a very good job of being very proactive in their succession planning efforts. And so I think this is an important topic for organizations to deal with, and something that I've engaged with my clients and have conducted some succession planning processes with them. And just to show that we practice what we preach, this is something in my role here as the CEO that I am engaged in constantly, because we have new partners coming, we have partners that are retiring. And so in preparing for my own departure, I'm pleased to announce here, and this will be coming out publicly here quite soon, that Bobby Hales will be succeeding me the first of the year as our firm's CEO. I'll be hanging around, if my partners let me, for another couple of years towards my retirement. But that is our plan. So again, we try to practice what we preach. When I saw the attendees, and you may have noticed in the invitation that we had a message in there where we really encouraged you to invite your board members. This session is really designed for your boards, and I suspect that most of you are not board members, and that's okay. I would suggest sharing this with your board members, and perhaps in future sessions, and there will be future sessions on this topic, that you consider inviting your board, because they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. So here's the things that we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about putting together a succession task force, some suggested transition timelines, the different types of leadership transitions that organizations may encounter, steps to take when facing an unplanned departure. And then after you've made your decision and made your next CEO hire, what are some steps you can take to ensure their success? The flip side, what are some pitfalls to avoid during your executive search? So what is the board's number one job? I'm going to answer the question for you. This is not a polling question. And hopefully you know that the board's number one job is the identification, the hiring, occasionally firing of the executive director, the CEO. That is the most important thing they do. Certainly they're engaged in planning and strategy and discussions of operations, but ultimately the CEO is the one that runs the show. That's the board's number one job. That's why this is an important topic for boards. There was a survey done recently among a couple thousand nonprofit organizations. And in that survey, it indicated that nearly 60% had replaced a chief executive due to an unplanned departure or some other negative reason for their dismissal. So we know this happens a lot. Also, 50% of nonprofit CEOs indicated they intend to leave their position within 5 years. And we all know that there's millions of people like me that are graying, that are part of the baby boomer generation, that there's a number of those certainly in the nonprofit circles that are going to be moving towards their retirement. So there's going to be more and more succession issues. Interestingly, on average, among those who have departed, as many left on positive terms as they did on negative terms. So what should you do here? Do you wait for the shoe to fall or do you plan for it? Well, obviously the message behind this entire webinar is we think you should plan for it. Don't just wait for it to happen. So
hey Dave, let's roll out this. Let's roll out this polling question.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you,
Let's roll out our first one. All right. So first polling question: what is the state of your organization's succession planning? We'll give a few seconds here for everybody to cast their vote. More minutes. Final answer. All right, we're ending the poll and we'll share the results of that.
Okay, that's, I think that's probably about what I would expect. So half of you are saying, well, we've at least talked about it. So there's some progress there. A quarter of you have one in place. Congratulations for doing that. I hope you get something out of the session today that maybe you don't have within your existing plan. And then a quarter of you haven't started it. Again, no reason to be embarrassed. I suspect that there's plenty of your brethren out there who have not. Okay, so succession planning obviously is a proactive process. When I think nonprofits and organizations in general think about succession, they think about the search process. But a chief executive search is really a reactive process. It's intermittent. Of course, it comes along only when there's a change at the top, usually driven by a deadline. We need to go get someone. We need to find a replacement, whatever. So it can be a stressful event, of course. But succession planning is really a continuous process. And the concept of it is that it's going to help boards create some conditions for them to be more successful. As you'll see in the discussion here, there's a lot of emphasis on strategy, current and future strategy. So as you go through the succession planning process, much of the dialogue that you will have within your task force has to do with future strategy of the organization, because that, of course, is going to impact the type of person that you'll want in that seat when that opportunity comes along. And then you want to make sure, of course, that the fundamentals are in place when the next search is needed, so that you're not all running around with your hair on fire, which is fairly common, of course. So let's talk about a succession planning task force. And I love task force. I think my partners have even heard me use that term here in the office when we have some activity that we need to engage. And I like it better than committee, because committee implies something that's going to be continuous, that has to meet very, very regularly, and that may never go away. A task force, you assemble a group of people, attack the problem, and go back to your day job when it's all done. So let's talk about what is involved in a succession task force. First of all, I think like any committee or task force, putting together a charter is a really good idea, because your the existing CEO or your co-board members are going to want to know what this task force is up to, how they will interact with the board, what level of authority they have or do not have. So putting together a charter that identifies that, makes sure that everyone's on the same page. So I highly recommend that, not just for this situation, but anytime you put together a committee or a task force. Members, certainly select board members. You certainly don't have to have the entire board. I think having the current CEO or executive director on there is helpful. There may be some select staff members, depending on the organization, how large you are. If you have some very senior staff, it may make sense to have some of those. You might even look at other stakeholders. You have some key funders or other supporters. It may make sense to even have some of them serve on this task force. So I mentioned a moment ago that part of the challenge here, part of the task, is really to envision what your future is going to look like as an organization and what kind of leader will you need. So the starting place is to go to your strategic plan. Hopefully you've all have a strategic plan or are going to be engaging in that process in the near future. And so what are some of those objectives or challenges or opportunities that are identified in the strategic plan? Within that, what key competencies do you think are going to be required in your next chief executive? Is there a particular leadership style that is preferred? Are there some elements of leadership that that perhaps you have currently that you would like to not have in the next individual? What kind of expertise and experience is desired? We'll talk about this a little bit more because oftentimes there's an emphasis on the sense that you need to have someone who has specialized expertise in whatever field it is that your nonprofit is conducting. That's not always the best approach, but that's something that you'll want to discuss. And based upon all of these items that I've discussed, you'll want to consider updating the job description. And as you might imagine, if the existing CEO is part of this process, you may identify some things that perhaps are not attributes of your current CEO. Is that a little bit awkward? Perhaps so, but would that be unusual? Heck no. There's certainly many skills and attributes that CEOs have, and there's always going to be certain attributes that they don't have. And so as you look to the future of the organization, there's nothing wrong with saying, as we've gone through this process of considering what sort of strategy we may be taking in the future, what our future challenges may be, considering how that may impact the kinds of skills that your next executive may need. And again, as it relates to your current executive, if you've identified some things that are absent, then you can certainly have a discussion about some developmental assistance. There's nothing wrong with having leadership or development of your leaders. We certainly do that in our firm here. Not all of the people that ascend to any position of leadership can be expected to have all of the requisite skills. So providing some development assistance certainly is not unusual. Okay.
One of the questions that's come through in the chat, and maybe you can kind of interweave this into the discussion, is, right now we're addressing some of the specifics about succession related to a CEO position, but how can some of this process also apply to succession on the board of directors? So, that's one of the questions. Does it apply to that, and to what extent does this process apply?
I think that I don't know that this does exactly, but as you're going to hear later on in the discussion, part of the process that a board will want to go through as they're considering the succession of the CEO is, do we have all of the right people at the board level in those seats? Are there some holes? Are there some gaps? Are there some skills and talents and expertise that we are missing as board members? So as you'll hear later on in the conversation, Bobby, I think that as organizations go through this succession planning process, it's a really good opportunity for them to assess where they are with their board and to consider whether there may be some needs to upgrade or fill in some missing pieces within their board. So I suspect within this, there'll be some takeaways that may apply to that process of how you might go about identifying and considering where some of those gaps may be with board members, but that's how I would view that. Okay, so as part of this succession task force, you'll want to anticipate what some of the communication needs are going to be. Communication, of course, is going to be critical in any succession of an organization. There may be concerns about the organization's direction. You'll want to alleviate those. Again, whether this is a planned departure, i.e., you've gotten a year's notice that the CEO is going to be leaving, or whether that departure is sudden. Hey, I'm out of here in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. You're going to need to be able to enact a plan, a communication plan to alleviate some of those concerns about where the organization is going. The types of people or the individuals that you'll want to be having that communication with is potentially all stakeholders, certainly beginning with, of course, your staff, but funders, civic leaders, even past board members might be included within that communication. So the kinds of events that may trigger some of these communications, of course, the departure itself, but as we'll talk about later, you may have an interim leader. So you may want to prepare for an announcement regarding that interim leader, having a discussion about the fact that you have a search process underway, I think can be helpful, can be sort of calming, and may even result in potentially some referrals to you during that process. And then, of course, things as simple as congratulating retiring executives, sending out some well wishes and some positives that your funders and supporters can see. And then, of course, lastly, welcoming the newly selected executive. So here's, Bobby, this I think perhaps touches on that question that came up a moment ago. As part of this process with the succession planning task force, this is a really good opportunity to step back and ask yourself, where are we as a board? And this is something that is not done often enough by boards, and it certainly doesn't have to be done as part of this succession planning task force. I have it in here because I think this is a really good opportunity to do it. But I think any board at any point in time, if it hasn't done one of these, this is a really effective technique to ask yourselves, is the board effective and engaged? As I mentioned a moment ago, based on the question you received, are there any gaps in board skills and abilities, opportunities for improvement? Again, this is a good exercise to conduct periodically. I didn't mention, but I'm a certified governance trainer through BoardSource, which is a national nonprofit whose mission itself is to help nonprofit boards become more effective. And they have a tool, and I've applied this tool with clients in the past. They have a board self-assessment tool. Yes, of course, it costs money, but this is a really meaningful and effective way to help your board become better at what it does. So again, as part of this succession planning process, again, if you have something you haven't already done, consider a board self-assessment. This task force can think about search and transition costs. And of course, one of the first questions that's going to come up in that regard is, do we use a search firm or do we not use a search firm? And there's some real advantages of using a search firm, of course. I think that oftentimes, of course, this is driven by the organization's size and its budget. Those that are on the smaller end, the first thing they're going to think is, we can't afford to do that. We're going to have to do this on their own. And those that have more significant budgets, what I see generally in practice is that they don't hesitate to use search firms. But this is something you can talk about as a task force. You can address how your organization will deal with this when you get to this point. In the event that you consider this to be sort of beyond your budget, you might ask yourself if this is an event that may trigger the use of reserves. If you've been so fortunate to be able to as a nonprofit to be able to build up your reserves and have a reasonable reserve. I can't think of a better reason to tap into those reserves than a situation where you're going to be searching for a new executive. So I would, if it was me, I would absolutely consider that, because the alternative is really to say, hey, Joe, who do you know? I know a guy, I know a woman kind of thing. And I don't know that that often results in the best possible candidates out there. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. Some of the other transition costs that the task force will want to consider are potential severance costs for the departing executive. You may have a signing bonus. There could be relocation costs. You may be even looking at, depending on how long that person has been there, or market conditions that have changed, or the experience level that you're of the individual bringing in. You may even need to think about potentially an increased salary for the incoming executive. You might also have some overlapping salaries, because in an ideal situation, if you have somebody, an executive who has suddenly departed, then you may want to arrange for them to be on board for, I don't know, some period of time, a month or two perhaps, to help with that transition. So there's a cost to that. Develop an executive transition timeline. So barring a sudden departure of an executive, these transitions can be a lengthy process. At 12 months would not be unreasonable at all in situations where the departure date is known. So the task force should develop an estimated timeline. And that leads us to our next topic here. And that is some suggested timelines for I'm going to assume here, a 1-year planned departure. You're certainly welcome to plug in other dates, as you'll see on this calendar, but I've done this based on sort of a simplified 1-year transition plan. So first step, I guess I like task forces, because here we are again, create an executive search task force. And this, I suppose it could be the same as your succession planning task force. Might be, it may not make sense to have the same people. So be thoughtful about who you want on this. Of course, the task here is different than succession planning. Now we're sort of drilling down, of course, to the actual process of finding this next leader. For some organizations, you may want to assign the executive committee. Again, as you've heard me say before, think about putting together a charter so that the task force's roles are clear, and that the other board members won't be surprised as they go through the process. Consider the use of a consultant to facilitate the process. I've done this with some clients myself. There's others that are out there. And so that can help keep the board on track, provide some specific information that the board may not be aware of to help them, help the result be more effective. Consider a board assessment. If not already addressed, this is something we talked about a moment ago. You want to make sure that the board is effective in its governance practices. And of course, the idea here is to position you for leadership during the transition. As we talked about also a moment ago, here's now another good time to pause and take a look at your board composition. It is more ideal to have a board that is fully running, that has all the skills and attributes that you would ideally like to have. That's a whole nother webinar to talk about that. And there's plenty of tools out there to help you figure out that you have the right board people on the bus. But this is a good opportunity to give that some thought and to implement a board development plan as needed. Now, here's a really key part, I think, of this process that I really like and highly recommend. So as long as you have the advantage of a long lead time in identifying the next executive, why not find out from your stakeholders what it is about the organization that might be, where there may be some opportunities for improvement or some strategic shifts in direction. So I highly recommend, and this can come from the board, it can come from a consultant, it could come from someone who's effective at conducting surveys, but that you go out to your stakeholders, board members, key staff members, funders. Talk to them or ask them questions such as, what are our greatest strengths? What are some issues that you're aware of that may affect our ability to provide services successfully in the future? What are some long-term considerations that could impact our mission? And what changes would you recommend to help address those issues? I'm going to skip to number 3 because I think I probably should have had it before number 2. But along that same line, consider also asking these stakeholders some of these questions. These now, versus the items here in 1, which focused on the organization, are now asking your stakeholders for some input regarding the next CEO. And so some of the questions here for you to consider are, what are some of our challenges that should fall under the new CEO's responsibilities? What is some of the expertise that you think is required? What are some of the key competencies, revenue development, financial oversight? Again, you may have somebody in place that may not possess all of these things, or that may not be their highest and best use. Certainly wouldn't be unusual as the organization has advanced, or you're looking at its at your strategy in the future. Are some of these key competencies now more critical for this next individual? Great opportunity to get input on that. What about the required leadership style? Are there unique elements of their style that you think will be more effective? And are there some traits that are not desired? Now I'm going to go back to number 2, because this is probably better timing for this question. And so now, based on all of this input, identify any differences which you might expect between the outgoing and the incoming CEO. So this is a great opportunity to reflect, to receive critical input, and think about what are the key characteristics that are going to be important for us as an organization to be successful in the future. Okay, so again, I think this is really critical. I think this is a great opportunity for the board and for this task force to really engage in this process and be really thoughtful about the next CEO you bring in, rather than just a collection of opinions about Joe or Mary, who's there now, and thoughts that may not be as strategic and as thoughtful as they could be. So now that we've done all this, now we can develop a CEO succession timeline. Of course, begin with the current CEO's anticipated departure date. You can identify based on that when to begin the actual search process, and then consider some time for any startup, any transition overlap of CEOs. We've talked about this before, but now this the succession, the search task force can also now revisit this question of the search process, whether it's going to be done strictly internally or whether it's going to be based on an external process. You know, I mentioned this a few moments ago, but I think there's really some opportunities, and I'm not getting a commission from this or anything, but I do think there are some key advantages to considering a search consultant. First of all, you're going to want, as an organization, to be able to see, you know, a diverse pool of the most qualified candidates that you possibly can. And it's not reasonable to think that your board members or that a couple of ads in some online search is going to result in all of the top candidates. I know we see this in our business. Some of the best people that are out there, of course, they have jobs and they may not be looking for a job. They need someone to tap them on the shoulder and say, would you think about this? That's not something your board members are going to do. So for that reason alone, again, trying to identify the best possible candidates, I think that's a reason to consider that. Your search task force may need help in screening applicants and nominees. They may not have the expertise in interviews, although they're going to be asked to participate in that process. But some of the more critical interview questions might be done more effectively by a professional. And then lastly, when you get down to the negotiation, your search professional can help you with that. So again, no commissions here. It's not a service we provide, but I do think it's something that you should consider strongly. Okay, so now we're into the second 6-month period of this year-long process. You've done all of your fundamental work. Now you're ready to update your CEO job description based on all this input you obtained. You probably had a CEO job description the last time you hired one, but guess what? There's a good chance that now, based on this input, that description may change. So by all means, update. Go ahead and begin the process for engaging a search firm. I just talked to a client recently, and they were interviewing several firms for a search for themselves. So by all means, if that's what you feel you need to do, then do that. And then establish a target date for identifying the candidates. Discuss the process for handling any internal candidates. This can be a delicate process. You want to be careful with it. And when I say internal candidates, this could be senior employees who would like to put their name in the hat, but also board members. I've seen this happen before. I served on a board where we had a board member who was interested in the position. And then anytime you have that, any of these internal candidates, the process becomes pretty delicate. So you want to handle them carefully. As if you have a board member, that person should, of course, immediately resign if they can no longer function objectively as a board member if they're putting their name in the hat. And then, of course, if you've got some internal candidates, you'll want to treat them professionally and delicately. So now in this remaining 6-month period, determine who's going to serve on the interview committee. Could be the same individuals who served on the executive task force. You may want to engage in some other individuals. Facilitate office and staff visits. If you do have staff meet with your finalists, you want to be very clear what role they have. I think that it's okay to have staff. I think it's probably a good practice to have staff meet with your finalists. You just need to make it clear to the staff, certainly as board members, that while you're interested in their in whatever input they have to understand that they don't get a vote. This is the board's #1 responsibility. So I just want to make that real clear so that there's no hard feelings. Round 2 interviews conducted by, it may be even now a subset of the interview committee. Maybe you're really getting down to just a very small handful of individuals on the board, your board chair, maybe a couple of other key board members who are going to conduct the final interviews. They make the selection ratified by the board, and then the offer is secured. Okay, now what? So now we're into the post-hiring process. And I think I'm going to be talking about this towards the end. We talk about some conditions for success after hiring the CEO, but so I'll cover it a little bit more later. But you want to clarify the onboarding and orientation process. As I mentioned a moment ago, if there's any role that the current CEO is going to have, you want to figure out what that's going to be, create some goals for the new CEO, set up a 6-month review process. Again, I'm going to go into this in a little more detail a little bit later, but these are important elements post-hiring. I think that oftentimes boards get to this point and they think that they're done, and really they're not. It's some of this these processes after hiring can be just as important as the hiring process. Okay, Bobby, you have any questions that have popped up? Can we just continue?
Just continue on. No questions so far.
Okay, very good. All right, so there's, I received some information through BoardSource. I thought this was kind of interesting. You might resemble yourselves or some other organization that you know of in this, but they've identified some classic leadership types. And there may be, this could impact how the organization and its board decides to handle some of these transitions. So the first one, and perhaps you all fall into this category, the organization's well led. The organization is successful. Most of its components are performing well. And so the nature of the conversation that the board may have is, hey, we don't want to miss a beat. Let's just keep the ball rolling. And so I think as individuals involved in the succession for this type of transition. I think that the board members are going to want to resist the temptation to find someone who's just like the departing executive. Certainly, they were part of that success. But again, if you consider what we talked about a moment ago, there may be changes in the organization's needs, its strategy. And so what made you successful up to this point may not be the same conditions that will make you successful in the future. So I think it's important for the board to take a hard look at the current conditions, as well as the current executives' sort of responsibilities and workload in considering what you need in the next leader. The second type of organization would be one at the other end of the spectrum. They're really underperforming, or maybe it's peaked and it's starting to decline. So board members, staff would be wondering if you're doing enough. Maybe some of what you've been doing is getting a little bit stale. And so the transition discussions may include some, again, concerns about your business model or operating method. So in this situation, the main challenge is identifying what those underlying issues are. Again, I think in that succession planning process we discussed a moment ago, that's going to be a great opportunity to dig out what are some of the things that are working or that we need to fix to get this organization on track. So that's going to be key to the board. And then you'll want to reorient the executive's job to make sure you're fitting, that it's now fitting the organization's current needs. Okay, we don't see this too often, but there are organizations that are just like in the for-profit world that are really in a turnaround situation. They've reached this perilous state. Conditions may have really deteriorated. Demand for services has declined. Revenues have declined. There may have even been some scandal or some mismanagement. Maybe there's been a fraud or something. So this is a very difficult situation for the board. The first things they'll need to do is step in and do things to sort of stabilize the organization. In some situations, if it's so severe, the board may even need to consider situations where they perhaps are acquired or that they may merge with a similar type of nonprofit that can help them both be successful going forward. It may make sense in this situation to consider some sort of interim leadership. So while you're seeking a permanent CEO, it may be more opportune to have an interim person who can really kind of right the ship while you're sorting out some of these things that need to be done to make you effective in the future. Again, probably none of you out there, but some organizations that are in a startup mode or that have been in all volunteer mode, maybe they're hiring their first CEO. I was fortunate to be involved in this years ago. For any of you who are Sacramentans or longtime Sacramentans, if you've heard of Fairy Tale Town, it hasn't always been run the way it is run today. It was run by the city, and a nonprofit was formed to essentially take over management of Fairy Tale Town. And we hired its first ever executive director, who just retired a couple of years ago. But anyway, so this is an exciting opportunity for the board. Some of the things that I want to think about are obviously the kind of experience that they have, the sort of demands that are likely to be placed on that individual, since it may be coming out of a situation again where it's been all volunteer, or as the example I gave you with Fairy Tale Town, where it's had no prior executive director or CEO. It's likely to be a very intense process for them, and one that will require a lot of work. So those are some of the things that the board will need to consider there. And lastly, and I have seen some of these, but there's a classic situation where the nonprofit has a founder, an individual who was the founder, maybe someone who was highly entrepreneurial, or someone who just has been in that role a long time. And that has its own challenges, I think, for an organization. There's a culture that's been built around them. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of relationships. This can be a really difficult challenge for the board. We had a client years ago, now known as TLCS, now known as Hope Cooperative, And I remember they operated for many years with a founder, and that was a difficult situation for them to transition into. So you want to identify as board members what some of the vulnerabilities are, some of the things that I mentioned here, the relationships, the organization's culture, and think about whether it makes sense to have someone who, well, it's highly unlikely that the organization is going to succeed by having someone who is exactly like the founder, even though they may have done an extraordinary job. So again, you'll want to make sure you go through the process, as I outlined a few moments ago, of identifying all of the new strategies and new challenges that your organization has to see if to see the kinds of skills and attributes that you need in the new executive. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and let's go ahead and send out the second poll here.
Okay, Bobby.
And let me get this up. All right, so just a poll on which of the classic leadership types do you think your organization will resemble during your next transition?
I'm going to guess most will be sustained success. People that signed up for this probably are running effective organizations.
Another couple of minutes.
But there could be some hard to follow executives too. And we have those clients that are, where you have CEOs that have been in place a long time. I think one of them signed up for this session. I don't know if she's out there. I won't mention the name.
All right, we're going to close it off. And here we go.
Oh, look at that. Okay, so I'm not surprised by the 71%. Again, I would have assumed many of you in the audience fell into that category, but also very interesting that almost a third of you say that you're in a situation where there's going to be hard to follow executive. Again, I suppose you could say perhaps a nice problem to have, in that presumably if this person is hard to follow, that means that there's been some success, but it also does present some challenges, as I mentioned. So the board will want to be very thoughtful. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that process of communicating with your stakeholders about what the critical needs are of the organization going forward, I can't think of a better opportunity or a better situation to do that than to ask them what they think the needs are in the next executive. That would just seem paramount to me to do in that situation, Bobby, where you have a hard to follow executive. Again, great opportunity for the board there. Okay, so I just went through kind of a timeline of, you're in a most enviable situation where your CEO says, guys, I'm going to be leaving. I'm giving you a year's notice. I'm retiring, whatever. That's awesome. The committee can be just so effective in what they do. But of course, that's not the real world. There's situations, plenty of situations where you have an unplanned departure. So as I noted here, guess what? If you've got a succession plan in place, a lot of the legwork in these items has already been completed, or you've got it documented, or you've got a game plan to move forward. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because most of this is kind of a repeat of what we discussed, but you'll need to have, of course, there's just more of a sense of urgency here now, but besides the board chair probably being the first person to be notified of this departure, he or she will then want to let the rest of the board know, begin to let staff know, and then of course, your key stakeholders. You'll want to consider financial oversight anytime these changes happen. There's concerns about balls being dropped with cash coming in, cash going out the door. So take a look at signatories. Most organizations we see have multiple signatories. So in all likelihood, your organization hopefully already has some other persons as signatories on bank accounts. So you won't have to rush to get new ones, but you'll want to consider that. You'll want to talk to your financial advisors. If you have an investment portfolio, you'll want to let them know. Of course, talk to your CPAs, let them know. It could affect some of the work that they're doing. Especially if they're providing any assurance services to you, they want to be certainly aware of that. And then you want to be aware of any key deadlines, especially payroll tax filings. Those are some of the things that can fall through the cracks. again, hopefully there's processes in place that there's no beats that are missed in that. But I think as board members, you want to make sure that those things are being taken care of because they have some pretty stiff penalties if not. Also, of course, your 990 grant applications, talk to the fund development people, make sure that those things are still rolling along, and any reporting obligations that you have with your funders. This is a situation where you will want to consider interim management. That could be in the form of an acting chief executive and maybe a staff member. I have here a board member that I don't really like that much, but I don't like the idea of board members stepping into a role of also serving as a key staff member or the interim chief executive in this case. I know for some smaller nonprofits, sometimes this may seem like the best route, but I don't like the potential conflicts that you have with an individual serving board roles. But I understand that does happen at times. But also an interim chief executive is a really good route to go. It does buy you time. Again, it gives you time to not feel that you have to rush into a decision that may end up not being the best decision you could make. So you can find those individuals at times locally through referrals. There are firms that like ours that specialize in the sector. And so sometimes we don't provide CEO services, but there are times we can provide referrals. And I mentioned this organization. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of them. I think they're based in Seattle. And I know at one time there was a couple of individuals here locally that represented them, but there's an organization called Third Sector that has a highly vetted group of interim CEOs nationally. And so they are able to place persons into those interim positions. So you might jot that name down if you ever find yourself in that position. And then, of course, you'll want to go into the executive search process. Again, are we going to need a search firm? Something I would generally recognize if you can fit it in your budget, search committee, charter, all of what I discussed before. And I think as board members, you might look at how the organization is functioning during periods when your CEO is out. So when they're on vacation, is there somebody in a senior level that is able to step up? Is the organization flailing while the CEO is absent? I think these are good opportunities to look to see how the organization is functioning in his or her absence. Okay, we're kind of on the home stretch here. I think we're reasonably on schedule. So I touched on some of this a moment ago, or talked about the importance of this, I should say. So you've hired your CEO, and now what? Again, I think it's real easy to say, let's all pat ourselves on the back. We did a great job. We've got a great new person here. But I think that whether it's your succession task force, your search task force, I don't care, your executive committee, somebody should take charge of this transition process. So consider putting together a transition team. Again, it may be one of those task forces that I already mentioned, maybe a different group of people. Provide some orientation for this new CEO that'll help them be successful. Provide introductions to key funders, introductions to board members, and put them in a position where they can be successful. I think one of the things that is really effective is to encourage the CEO to conduct some interviews with staff, current and former board members. I serve on a board, and one of the things I thought was really cool was that the new CEO called me up as well as all the other board members, and we talked for about an hour. We talked about what I thought was working for the organization, concerns that I had, suggestions for improvement. I think that was a great way to orient the new CEO to create some of this level of engagement. So I think this is a really important process for the CEO to go through. Define the mutual expectations. And I suppose this goes hand in hand with the bullet after that, which is 6 and 12-month goals. I think as a board, or again, it can be this committee or even just the board chair, But I think it should be made really clear what you're hoping for the new CEO to accomplish in the next 6 months, and that there should be mutual agreement on that. I really like the process of setting goals. I think that having both a 6 and a 12-month goal is really appropriate for a new CEO. They're going to, of course, look differently. 6 months being more transitional, more sort of getting up to speed for that individual. 12-month goals being a little more performance based. This also provides a process for the review of the executive, which is a whole nother subject, but also something that I find among many of the nonprofits I deal with do not have a very effective process for doing regular performance reviews. Oftentimes the ball is dropped, but even when the process is in place, it's often based on sort of subjective factors, things that don't have a lot of meat, a lot of teeth in them. So I really like the idea of putting together a set of goals, and this of course can be vetted with the board in its entirety before being presented to the CEO, but having a set of goals that are consistent with your strategic plan and the big picture objectives of the organization that keeps the CEO and the board focused on those key objectives. And then of course, when their review and salary considerations or supplemental compensation considerations come around, now you've got something that you can really, that you have an objective basis for that discussion. So I highly recommend that. And then of course, continued succession planning cycle. Again, it would be real easy to say, we've got a new CEO, we're done. But I recommend, I don't know, I'd say at least within a year after that new CEO is on board, get the band back together, get the succession task force back together and begin that process, have it in place. Again, the whole concept of this discussion here today is we don't want to wait for somebody to leave before we start going crazy with all of what we need to do. We want to have a process in place. So within a year of the new CEO coming on board, start the succession planning process again. It may be that it'll be maybe as simple as just providing updates to what you've done previously, but it'll still be nice to have on hand.
And Dave, we've got one last polling question.
Okay,
we wanted
have
to
at it,
throw out
Bobby.
there.
Good.
All right, so how would you describe the effectiveness of the transition process for the most recently hired CEO?
There we go. Okay, so what kind of job do you think you folks are doing out there in your most recent transition process?
Another couple seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Here we go.
Very good. Okay. Well, most of you feel that you have most of the bases, 2/3 of you think you have most of the bases covered. Very nice. Good to see. What process? All right. I have at least one of those. Thanks for your honesty. Okay. Good thing these are hidden polls, right, Bobby? All right. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. What are some of the pitfalls that you may want to avoid as you go through your executive search process? So one, overemphasis on compensation. I think it's real easy for board members to focus on because this is such a personal item and everybody can relate to it, right? Everybody can relate to compensation. So they may get over-engaged in compensation when there are issues that certainly are much more critical to the process than that. Obviously, you need to be competitive, but make sure that the discussion that takes place isn't focused by the board members in that final process, isn't focused on compensation. Secondly, emphasizing mission or sector experience versus leadership and management skills. So I think in this era, leadership skills are what most organizations are looking for and what they value the most in the executives that they bring on board. Everyone, of course, would like to bring people on board that have experience that is relative to their particular mission or the sector that you're working in, but to emphasize that without regard to the individual's leadership characteristics, or to maybe even have it be subservient to their leadership skills and experience, could very well be a mistake. Falling for chemistry. Oh, love this person. Bobby and I have never done this with any of the people we've ever hired here. So we never do this, but you find somebody, and oh my gosh, they're just so wonderful. And we always talk about the halo effect. You know, they have some of the characteristics that I have. So boom, halo goes on to them. But so be careful with that. Be diligent in checking your references. Again, this is an area where your search firm, if you use one, can be really effective at that, because they can ask the really difficult questions of the reference sources that and be able to identify some of those references that you may not. Touched on this earlier, but be careful with mishandling candidates to come from the board. You want to be fair with them. You don't want to alienate them, because they obviously have been supporters of the organization. So just be very careful if you do have any internal candidates, either as staff or board. And then withholding key information. This, I suppose, goes without saying, but if there are some ghosts in the closet, is that the term? Whatever. If there's some negatives that have taken place at the organization, make sure you don't keep that from your candidates. Make sure that you're completely transparent, so that they don't come in and say, oh my gosh, you didn't tell me about this bad deed, or this information I think is really critical in my ability to run the organization, or maybe even in my thought process to whether to accept the position. So don't do that. So lastly here, I just have a few warning signs of inadequate succession planning. So you could have a situation where the retirement or the departure of the CEO has been delayed because of reluctance of the board or the CEO to discuss their plans in advance. If there has been deteriorating morale or deteriorating financial conditions, that could be an indicator that your succession planning is not where it needs to be. If you have a founder, a chief executive, someone who's been there for a long time, who's just no longer the right leader. If you have high turnover of senior staff members, staff and board members who chronically complain and share problems, there's a lack of trust. If you have an inability to make progress, institutional progress as a result of sort of a lack of shared vision, that might be an indication that your succession planning process is not where it needs to be. So I think that's going to wrap it up here. If there's any final questions, I'll be happy to take them on. I hope that you found this useful, and I expect to have some other discussions about succession planning in the future, where we'll dive into some of these topics a little bit deeper. And if you have any questions now, you can certainly send them out there. Otherwise, Bobby will be sending out, as you mentioned, we'll be sending out copies of this presentation to them, and you have our contact information. We'll be happy to help if you need some assistance. Anything else out there, Bobby?
Nope, nothing else. I answered a couple of questions just directly, particularly about contacting for some more specifics or referrals. But other than that, I think we're good to go.
Great. Hey, guess what? We're right at an hour, so you can resume the rest of your day. Anyway,
thank you all.
Bobby and I thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.